I'm Ali-reza Bhojani. I am a teaching fellow at the moment at the University of Birmingham in Islamic theology and Islamic ethics. It's a privilege to be with this group, and my apologies to all yesterday for not being able to participate fully. Let me just share my screen and then inshallah I will begin. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, so the title of the paper, Reclaiming Space for God Talk, Theories of Ijtihad and Intra-Muslim Differences in Matters of Belief. So the rationale, part of the rationale, or the driving rationale behind the paper is to help engage with one of the broader objectives of the project, and that is a revival of God Talk. But it's not any God talk which I would seek to help contribute to revive it. It is a substantive and dynamic God talk. And a substantive and dynamic God talk, I feel, demands a space and an ethics for engaging with difference. If there's no space for difference, there's little space to talk productively. Because talking with the assumption that others' opinions are flatly incorrect typically descends into dogmatic polemics, aiming to showing the other is wrong and that the self is correct. So dogmatic theology has grave spiritual and moral risks for individuals and societies, whether this be those who consider themselves scholarly individuals and within scholarly communities and societies, or whether we're thinking about individuals and societies more widely. And of course, these risks of dogmatic theology are compounded when it's held that even the slightest error in fundamental doctrine is tantamount to disbelief. So these concerns for the risks of theology are not new. And one of the most influential treatments attempting to qualify these risks have been given, of course, by the giant Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. His Faisal at-Tafrika was motivated explicitly by such concerns, and some of the troubling intolerance he found within theological discourse and theological objectives of his day. Sherman Jackson describes the work as being aimed towards tempering both theological intolerance and theological indifference. Right belief still matters. And he emphasized the role for interpretation and accounting for difference of opinion, adding importantly that kufr, or unbelief, is only ultimately as a result of negating truth in the Prophet himself, not necessarily or considering the Prophet a liar himself, holding a belief which would be tantamount to considering the Prophet liar. Holding incorrect beliefs isn't tantamount to disbelief. Ghazali's treatment here of, and it's translated by Sherman Jackson as the boundaries of theological tolerance in Islam. His contributions to theological tolerance in Islam have been deeply, deeply influential, both in contemporary Islamic studies literature and historically across schools and across diverse streams of thinking. However, Ghazali still held that errors in fundamental beliefs are sinful and accountable before God. He held that sin and error are co-correlates, if you like, based on his presumption that fundamental doctrines are definitive, okay, and purely rational. As he states in his al-Mustasfa fi al-Usul, one of his later works, that the truth in such matters can be only one. Whoever is wrong about the truth is a sinner. He continues in the al-Mustasfa to say that what did he include within these issues which he felt were the evidence for these things were definitive, and error in these issues is tantamount to sin. He included with these issues the core subject matter of God talk, the core subject matter of the volume which we're engaging with within this project. He cited examples, the origination of the world, establishing the originator, his necessary, possible, impossible attributes, the sending of prophets, blessings of God be upon them, their verification through miracles, the beatific vision, the createdness of actions, the will of the world, and everything in which there is talk amongst the Mu'tazila, the Khawarij, the Rafida, and the innovators. Of course, there are, as an Ash'ari theologian, you know, we have to, Al-Ghazali was speaking as an Ash'ari theologian, but we should note that there are differences on the substance of each of these doctrines within the Ash'ari school itself. So we see there's a tension here between engaging in God talk and the risk of error, particularly when it's potentially leading to sin, and for some, okay, actually tantamount to unbelief. Speaking to some of the comments which Iqbal Nasim mentioned, very, very useful comments, you know, and reminders that he gave us, that maybe this is one of the hesitations for people to engage with the Quran independently. Okay, they're worried about incorrect belief. Okay, scholars, when they're engaging with theology, tend to be very flat in the discussions of theology because they're concerned with risks of unbelief, with risks of error, with risk of sin. So in the paper, what do? I want to examine theories of Ijtihad in Usul al-Din as a resource for developing an ethics of God talk, which allows for an engagement through difference rather than despite difference, without an indifference to truth or an intolerance of error. And it's also, as a footnote, it's also a reminder that the jurisprudential discourses, because obviously discussion of Ijtihad is first and foremost emerged through the jurisprudential discourses of Islam. So I hope to, draw some attention to the fact that the jurisprudential discourses historically were not exclusively worldly. They were also a form of God talk. Yes, particularly through history and in the contemporary period, the way the discourses of around Sharia and fiqh are being used and applied is often, overtly worldly. But for many, it was a form of God talk. But my main concern is to examine the ideas of two very, very different thinkers. One being Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century Sunni traditionalist, and the other Mirza al-Qummi, a 19th century Shia Usuli. Both argue that sin is not necessarily concomitant with error in matters of fundamental belief, in matters of usul ad-din. Two very different thinkers who advocated different ideas. Both argue that accountability to before God in matters of fundamental beliefs is relative to sincere, rigorous, personal understanding. And it seems to me that within these theories or such examples, we can see resources encouraging the development of an ethics of pursuing truth with humility and an engagement with difference. So to ground the contribution of these two thinkers, or a brief summary, because I can see my time is flying, just something about theories of Ijtihad and their role in accounting for difference of opinion. So accepting a need for scholarly effort, Ijtihad in its general sense, a need for a struggle to understand, intellectual understanding, suggests there will be diversity. As soon as we accept a need for scholarly effort, okay, it suggests there will be diversity, because it presumes that the evidence is not absolutely definitive, and thus difference of opinion is likely. So how to account for the difference which would emerge if we accept there is a need for ijtihad in any sphere? So this is a classical controversy in usul al-fiqh, and particularly with matters of furu' al-fiqh, so i.e. the practice of Sharia. And two broad groups of theories emerged. One is referred to as tasweeb theories or inerrancy theories, the other taqti'a theories or fallibility theories. Tasweeb theories, where there are a group of theories, there's a diversity of responses. Here I'm just summarizing broadly. They argued that in the absence of explicit texts, all suitably determined opinions are correct. Every mujtahid is inerrant or correct. Taqta'a theories, on the other hand, says only a single position. The object of search in the ijtihad in any given circumstance can be correct. Al-musib is wahid. False opinions may be authoritative and excused if procedurally sound. So this is a general framework that emerged in response to diversity of opinion with regards to Sharia practice. What about when it comes to fundamental beliefs? okay, or if you like, with the frame of this workshop, conference, and volume in the context of God talk. There was wide agreement in the usul al-fiqh tradition that matters of fundamental beliefs, which were based on rationally accessible doctrines, could only have a single response, a single correct response. The correct position, and we've seen this alluded to in the Ghazali statement, which I quoted earlier on, the correct position in rational elements of fundamental doctrines is only one. Al-musib fil aqliyat is wahid. The world cannot be eternal and non-eternal at the same time. Either creation is a form of revelation, or it isn't. Okay, that is either or. And the typical, what's often portrayed as the typical position, is that as we've seen in Ghazali as well, is the implications of error here has impact in the hereafter. Considered a sin, worthy of divine punishment, and for many, even a cause of unbelief. So we see there's an apparent intolerance to diversity and difference in matters of belief within, vast swathes of Muslim theologians, scholars, and jurists. Let's go to Ibn Taymiyyah briefly, and then Mirza al-Qummi before I wrap up. So what does Ibn Taymiyyah have to say on this issue? In his Minhaj al-Sunnah, of course, it's a polemical treatise in the context, a particular section, in the context of responding to criticism over the Sahaba. He engages within a broad discussion and again critique of various views regarding these theories of inerrancy and fallibility of the mujtahid. And he actually rehabilitates and advocates a reading of a view attributed to a much benign view attributed to Ubayd bin al-Hasan al-Anbari. Within this, he undermines the distinction between usul ad-din and furu' ad-din. So he finds this a very problematic distinction, which is typical within scholarly discourse. He says there's no grounding in the Sunnah, in the Quran, within the works of the Imams, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, he argues, undermining the distinction between usul ad-din and furu' ad-din, that God does not hold responsible beyond one's capacity, citing, of course, various verses of the Quran, and that one is responsible to be wary of God to the extent that one is capable, citing the verse from Surah al-Fussilat. Coming to Ibn Taymiyyah's own words here, he says the mujtahid employing evidence, and here he's not talking about a mujtahid who's a specific expert in matters of Sharia inference. So we can see that explicitly here. So somebody who is intellectually struggling to understand, be he an imam, a judge, a scholar, a theologian thinker, a munadir, a debater, a mufti, or other than these, somebody who's engaging in a scholarly exercise to understand, or an intellectual exercise to understand. If he infers a position and is wary of God to the extent he is capable, then this is what Allah makes him accountable to. He is obedient to Allah and deserving of reward. If he is observant of it to the extent he is capable, he will not be punished. So he is musib in the sense that he is obedient to God. He is correct in the sense that he's obedient to God. But sometimes he knows the truth as it actually is, and sometimes he does not. Now to Mirza al-Qummi. Mirza al-Qummi, very different context, very different thinker, different methodological framework, very, extensive differences of opinion on various issues with somebody like Mirza al-Qummi, with Ibn Taymiyyah. Mirza al-Qummi himself, of course, became the most important scholar of Qum in his time, studied mainly in Iraq. I won't mention some of these details. The work which I'm going to refer to here is titled Qawanin al-Usul, a very, very influential text for training Shia ulama until very, very recently. Mirza al-Qummi on this debate in matters of belief, again argues, like Ibn Taymiyyah, the incorrect belief does not necessitate sin nor damnation. And he challenges the typical argument. So the typical argument framed quite neatly here in light of a verse of the Quran, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Know that there is no God but God. So there's a universal duty to know one's fundamental beliefs. So God must have given appropriate evidence. Therefore, incorrect belief reflects negligence and culpability. Right? So this is one form.
Ali-reza, you have 5 minutes.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So there's one formulation of a typical argument to say that, look, errors in fundamental beliefs are accountable, and punishable, because God tells us to know, tells us to believe, has given us signs If we don't get it right, we must be culpable, right? Mirza Qummi challenges this, and he says, look, this is only valid if the duty is to actually reach the truth and reality. Rather, the duty is to reach the truth in accordance to one's own investigations, assuming there is no willful negligence or minimalism. Okay, in the sense, in the language Ibn Taymiyyah used, to the extent we are capable of. He drew a very important distinction, Mirza Qummi, between the principle of one's doctrines and the details of those doctrines. So the principles of doctrines he accepted may be known definitively, universally, that there is a creator, there are prophets, there is a life to come. But the evidence of these details, the evidence for all the details of these beliefs are not universally definitive. The immateriality of God, the unity of his attributes, the temporality of the world, the nature of the intricacies of these doctrines, these have been contested. They are contested. Of course, unless established explicitly by God and his prophet, after having established the truth of God and his prophet. So truth in fundamental doctrines for Mirza, like Ibn Taymiyyah, is only one, but accountability is in accordance with our subjective understanding of that evidence and of those doctrines, assuming there is no negligence or obstinacy before truth, to the extent that truth is disclosed to the seeker. Kufr then, ultimately, is to fail to submit to truth as it is disclosed to me. So what am I trying to do is build towards an ethics of God talk. This is my final slide. And this is an example of us seeing where theories of ijtihad from two radically different thinkers, different contexts, different schools, have different ideas about the details of these doctrines that we're talking about. Okay, their theories of ijtihad can allow for an embrace of differences in belief. Neither Ibn Taymiyyah nor Mirza Qummi were indifferent to truth. They all assumed there was truth in reality, yet we may all be mistaken in our understanding of it. Neither were intolerant to error. They allow for the assumption that our errors may be sincere, not unbelief, and that our errors may be salvific. Accountability is in accordance with our own capacity and with our own understanding. It seems to me that such resources may encourage us to continually engage in God talk, whether that's in a scholarly context or a non-scholarly context, reflecting over the Quran, discussing different ideas with humility through our engagement with difference. As the verse of the Quran states, Ya ayyuhan nas inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'il lita'arafu. And in my reading, this lita'arafu may be to gain in understanding through each other, not simply to recognize each other. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Thank you very much. And I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Ali-reza. That was very nice. Thank you. And we've got Bilal, who put up his hand first. Over to you, Bilal.
Thank you. SubhanAllah. Thank you. Oh, man, that was awesome. I appreciate you so much. Listen, my brother, I wish you were with us Friday, but alhamdulillah, let's not go back. It was decreed that you weren't there. But anyway, I really wish, because you brought up this text, by al-Ghazali and the theological boundaries. And I want to ask you, because you brought up some other scholars in different times, but I want to ask you, in al-Ghazali's text, both in the one that you mentioned and in a few others, it's like he's having a dialogue, a pastoral counseling between an interlocutor about an issue. And he's explicating it as a pastoral, as pastoral care for the challenges that are facing his time. He's giving a counsel to the individual, but for the flock around him, for his time. In that text on theological boundaries, I found it to be that he was talking about speculative talk about God, warning against that, because in that text he also says to talk about God in the Quran or like narratives about the prophets is where most of like guidance where it will be found, and it's fine. And that little guidance comes from God talk that is like what these like theologians are doing. So he differentiates God talk, and he does it in a
All right,
pastoral.
well, thank you, Bilal. I guess we need Ali-Reza to respond to that. Yeah.
So my question is, can you see the different like theologians pastorally speaking to kind of care for the individual needs and the communal needs during their time?
Thank
So
you.
it's a brilliant question, and I think you're absolutely right that Ghazali was addressing particular needs at his time. He makes reference to them. Sherman Jackson, in his excellent introduction to the text, discusses them. That the practice of takfir was rampant. Within his own school, and he was worried about people thinking that he's gone outside the Ash'ari school. All right. Okay, so it wasn't even intra-school. There was there was within the Ash'ari, amongst the Ash'ari theologians that were concerned about, look, this idea has gone too far so far, and so on. So there was a pastoral concern. It wasn't here I gave a Sunni thinker and a Shia thinker. It wasn't Sunni Shia. Okay, it wasn't even necessarily intra-madhab. All right, he was concerned with how rampant practices takfir had become. But the work brings forward, and first and foremost in speculative theology and kalam, but the work itself is a much broader methodological contribution, actually, I think, right? So that pastoral concern, I think, developed and allowed him, or prompted him maybe, to give a much wider methodological contribution. So it's a brilliant work, been deeply influential, but I'm still concerned, with the pastoral impacts of having still maintained that errors in belief are sinful, right? Because I think that has if we think of our own pastoral context, okay, that still can dampen our willingness to engage independently, okay, with tafakkur and tadabbur, with the Quran, okay, or with each other, and so on and so forth, right? So Ghazali's massive leaps there still have that limit, where we see Ibn Taymiyyah and Mirza al-Qummi, okay, actually giving us resources who can help us to move beyond that as well. All right, so that, look, errors aren't necessarily sinful. This can give us a charitable engagement with the other. Okay, can help us. Ghazali is a great starting point. All right, but I think the other two can help us deal with our current pastoral issues. With Ghazali's influential contribution on board.
All right, well, thank you. We have Saifuddin has a question.
It's not a question, actually, it's a short comment. I just wanted to thank for this bringing the attention back to the ethics, from starting with the law and then moving to the ethics, because I think most of the issues currently we are facing is lack of focus on the ethics, and the humility. I think it's most important concept, as I see, because of when we look at the story of Adam and Hawa, the only thing saves Adam is his humility, that he accepts his mistake. And I think giving a chance to possibility of having a mistake is going to make life a lot easier for Muslims as well, because there is also this issue of arrogance of faith that we have been suffering, that we think our understanding of the religion is the only understanding. And I just wanted to thank that you are addressed this issue very well, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. We have Yasmin. You put your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I don't have a theological background, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But as I was listening to your presentation, this question came up in my mind. So as far as I can understand from reading the Quran, people of the book, which are like Jews, Christians, and I think sometimes Zoroastrians, are considered people of faith. But obviously, from an Islamic point of view, even though Christians are considered to be people of proper faith, their belief in the Trinity is wrong. So for those thinkers, those theologians who thought error meant sin, meant that that's sinful, how do they see this difference? Because on the one hand, the Quran says no, these people will not have husn in the afterlife and all of that. How do they answer that? Am I clear?
Very clear. And so I think it's a very rich question, and so I think you are a theologian, even if you haven't had theological training. Okay, asking good questions is the first sign, I think. Right. So it's a very rich question. So actually, asking about those who would consider the errors in Christian beliefs are condemned. So the verses which you refer to, they may say that they have been abrogated or qualified. All right, so those verses, couple of verses, one in Surah Baqarah, typically they may argue, this is a trend, okay? They will say they have been abrogated or qualified by such verses like in the deen Allah al-Islam, the only religion with God is Islam, or they would say those verses were talking about past Christians and Jews who were correct in their understanding of belief, right, and practice, okay? So that's one way that they would go. Those who are saying, look, incorrect belief, okay, means that they're accountable and potentially hellbound. How do we deal with those verses of the Quran which suggest that Christians and right acting Jews may be promised heaven? Okay, I have problems with the hermeneutical move as well as the framework. All right, and people, interestingly, if I may, both Ibn Taymiyyah and Mirza al-Qummi in the context of this discussion both explicitly afford for Christians and other non-Muslims who are sincere, okay, in their incorrect understandings, okay, to have salvific potential as a result. All right. Ibn Taymiyyah has a long section, discusses, for example, those Christians who gave sanctuary to the early Muslims emigrating from Mecca. Yeah, they accepted belief to the extent they understood it. Or they were believers, they protected the Muslims, although they didn't accept all of the doctrines of the Prophet Muhammad. The Mirza al-Qummi goes further. He says that even beyond beyond Islam, okay, if the belief is sincere, okay, and not there's no willful negligence in the pursuit of that belief, and there's submission to that belief, even if it denies Islam, they won't be treated as a kafir in the hereafter, okay, because they submitted to truth as it was disclosed to them.